Good evening. It's good to be back again. You see that our lesson is titled, How Well Do You Know the Bible? I think I need to see how well I know a copy machine. We tried to get this going up in the upstairs, and we were getting mess-fed paper. And Kay let me know we might have better luck downstairs, so we shot down the stairs. So I'm sorry, but hopefully there will be enough handouts. I've got about 50 there. If you've not got one or would like one, if you raise your hand, Brian has a few left. I mentioned this morning that I like it when someone presents something maybe in a new way or says something, looks at a passage in a different way that kind of makes me stop and think or reevaluate something that I thought that I knew. And I'm going to attempt something that I've never attempted before and try to present a lesson as kind of a series of questions and kind of a test. And I'm not, of course, going to take a grade at the end. I guess I was thinking earlier, well, we could figure out how many questions there were and figure out the percentage so that then if you want to see if you got an A or if you got a B or if you can pass this test. But this is just, this is kind of a review of some things that probably, you're going to be a tough crowd for them, and preaching to the choir, as they say. You have such a strong foundation, I said this morning, I may not be able to sneak any of these by you. But anyhow, these are some passages that maybe I find as commonly misunderstood or misquoted passages, not, in a bad way or by, intentionally, but just maybe people not stopping and looking at what's really being said. And so, please feel free to share any that you've thought of or that's not on here after services. You may think of some things that I've missed that would be good to consider. So, before we start going through the list and how well do you know the Bible, might just take a second to say that as Christians, we should know the Bible. As people who are supposed to be a light to the world, to be examples of those who know the truth, that is a big responsibility for us to make sure that we know the Bible and know the truth. I mentioned this morning a passage that, to be careful if you're a teacher, to receive stricter judgment. I think if we take on the responsibility of teaching others, we need to make sure that what we're teaching is the truth, that we know that we can find the answers, that maybe we don't assume that others will just take our word for it, but we can take them to a passage and teach them and hopefully keep the passage in context and show them because we know the truth. I guess I didn't have this written down, the passage that these were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They searched the scriptures daily to see that these things were so. We have the obligation to test and to know what is the truth. Well, I think there's going to be a lot of jumping all over the place as we cover through these. They are just about in order as far as moving through the Bible. In some, I maybe have used multiple passages. And if we have time, I'd like to stop and read some of these passages as we go through these. Hopefully, even some of you young kids will find something here that's maybe new to you. Maybe if the older ones know this, maybe the younger ones will see something that they didn't know. And some questions, when I write a test at school, I don't like to write questions like the true-false questions sometimes are worded in such a way it's almost, can you trick the person out of the right answer? But some of these questions may seem like they're worded in such a way that there can only be one answer, but I think this will make sense as we go through here. So the first one, who created the heavens and the earth? And if you see, I've got passages to go along with this. I think an obvious answer would be God created the heavens and the earth. But maybe even in teaching children from a very early age, I believe this goes back to Cliff Worthand, who taught this in a Bible class, and I marked it down about as soon as I heard it, that in this passage, Genesis chapter 1, the word there for God in Hebrew is Elohim. And Elohim means or translates to objects of our worship, as in a plurality. Okay? In verse 26, you see, then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So if God says, let us make man in our image, who's there besides God? Well, in the plurality we know about the Trinity. We have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. If that's not convincing to you, you could look at John chapter 1, And some of you could quote or know how the book of John begins. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him nothing was made that was made. Everything that's in existence was created while Jesus was there, and the Holy Spirit was there. We assume that there's this plurality. So we were part of God's plan, His choice to have us. Even before the world was created, they decided all this in advance. So you see how that one went? That went pretty smoothly. Let's go to number 2. Genesis chapter 2, we have the first individuals being created. Adam and Eve were created as adults. That may seem a little bit strange, because we obviously will have questions like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? Well, in this answer, they were created, we assume, as adults, because one of the first things that God had given to Adam was that he was to care for the garden. Okay, he's given a chore. Well, obviously, young babe couldn't do that. Some other strange questions would be, did Adam and Eve have belly buttons? So, you get into all this funny stuff. But the point I'd like to make here is, if Adam and Eve could be created with age, what else could have been created with age? Everything. And scientists would like to say, well, our fossils show that the Earth was around 50 million years ago. I don't have a problem with that, because at some point I realized if Adam was created with age, could not have created a rock with age. Could God have not made mountains and rocks 50 or 100 million years? And there's just some food for thought. Maybe don't let that be something that you struggle with, is the science behind that. God can create with age. Something that may be curious to you, where's the Garden of Eden? I mentioned we were talking about ancient Egypt, and I passed along to kids in class that some of our ancient people settled around some of the first rivers. And if you look in Genesis chapter 2, it mentions 4 main rivers, and 2 of the rivers mentioned there are the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Well, if you know your world geography, that would put you kind of around Iran and Iraq, okay, or Mesopotamia, or the Middle East. And interestingly enough, something that makes you kind of stop and wonder is, where do all of your oils come from? Are they not decayed fossil fuels, materials that break down under the ground? And so would that make you kind of put 2 and 2 together, that a long time ago all this lush, beautiful tropical area has deteriorated and we have the world's largest oil supply? It's kind of an interesting thought. Okay, so we don't know that the Garden of Eden still exists, but there's maybe evidence left behind. And lastly there, why did Adam and Eve have to leave the garden? Some might say, well, they ate of the tree they weren't supposed to eat of. They ate the fruit. The correct answer would be is that God did not want them to eat of the tree of life. And should have marked chapter 2. Look here, Genesis chapter 3 and verse 22, then the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us. There again, there's us. To know good and evil. And now lest he put out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. Therefore the Lord God sent him out of the Garden of Eden to till the ground from which he was taken. And he drove out the man, and he placed cherubim at the east end of the Garden of Eden, and a flaming sword which turned every way to guard the way of the tree of life. So they were sent out as a punishment for eating, but also because they didn't want them to eat the tree of life. Okay, let's move along a little bit further. How old was Noah when the flood came? This is not really a trick question, but just something to remember. Genesis chapter 7, verse 6 points out that Noah was 600 years old when the floodwaters were on the earth. So he was an older man, and he was told that God was going to destroy the earth, that he needed to prepare the ark and take in animals. And something that maybe is a common mistake, how many of each animal did Noah take on the ark? We always think he took 2. And the Bible does say that he took 2. If you read Genesis chapter 7 and verse 2 and 3, you shall take you, let's go back. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 19, of every living thing of all flesh you shall bring 2 of every sort into the ark to keep them. They shall be male and female. And then later in chapter 7, in verse 2, you shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female. And so, and later in chapter 7 and verse 15, it says, and they went into the ark to Noah. They went into the ark to Noah, 2 by 2 of all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Well, too argumentative, it seems that there were 7 of each clean animal and 2 of each unclean animal, unless I'm reading that wrong. So there maybe were many more animals. If there weren't just 2, that'd put even more on. Okay, so later on, as the rain is on the earth for about 40 days and nights, it's raining. The flood waters kind of come to an end, and Moses is checking to see if he can let out a bird to check for dry land. Did he send out a raven or a dove? Some of you know both. This is where it's hard, because we're not like a class where we're going to channel answers and be disruptive. Yeah, it's actually both. If you've forgotten, he first sent a raven, and then he sent out a dove twice. And so the first time the dove did not come back, did not have a place to land. The second time, it did not return. So there you had 2 weeks while he was waiting for dry land. How long was he on the ark? Again, it's much longer than 40 days and 40 nights. If you start reading and adding up the time frame, there are the 40 days and 40 nights. But then Genesis chapter 8, toward yeah, 13 and 14. Okay, chapter 8 and verse 3. The waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water decreased. So it makes me wonder if it rained 40 days and nights, and then it took 150 days to decrease, and then he sent out the bird for 2 weeks, and then it sent it out another 2 weeks. And I'm not doing very well with the math here, but that's a really long time, and I think maybe some speculate that he was actually on the ark about a year. And if Brian was mentioning verses 13 and 14, if I knew about maybe the Jewish calendar and about how many days were in their months, if it's equivalent to ours, if it's the same, I want to say that maybe a different amount of months. But in 13 and 14, it talks about the days of the month and when things dried out. Well, let's move on. Let's move toward Genesis 14 and Genesis 18. Do you remember? Abraham really cared a lot for his nephew, Lot. He cared a great deal, I should say. You probably remember the instance where he prays to God to save Lot from dying in Sodom and Gomorrah, but did you remember he also got into some trouble? Abraham allowed Lot to pick the fairest of the land, the best choice land, and Lot pitched his tent toward Sodom. And about Genesis 14, a king, I guess Kedorlaomer, comes out and attacks some of the kings of the region, and he takes Lot, runs off with a bunch of goods. And then Abraham sends out some of his servants to retrieve him, brings him back, and this is the instance where Abraham meets Melchizedek, and he offers him a tenth or tithe of everything. An interesting way that Abraham ends it, he says, I won't take any of the spoils unless you say I have made me rich, because Abraham trusted in God. But Abraham really, in 3 instances, he gave him the best of the land, and he went out and he rescued him, and then he prayed and prayed and prayed to God, almost begging or arguing with God on his behalf. Kind of a strange one that, as I was pulling these verses together, I came across one in Genesis 26. What in-laws caused grief in the Old Testament? And this is 26 and verse 30. Let's see. Genesis 26 and verse 35. So, you have Jacob and Esau, and they go out and have their own children, but at the end of chapter 26, it came to pass the same day that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well that they had dug and said, we found water, so he called it Sheba, therefore its name. The name of the city is Beersheba to this day. When Esau was 40 years old, he took his wives Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. And I don't know what mischief they would have pulled. I think that's interesting that there's one of your first instances of in-laws not getting together, I guess. We'll move on to Exodus chapter 17, verse 5 and 6, and Numbers 20 and verse 7. Something that's kind of interesting to me is the instances where Moses speaks to, or was supposed to speak to, a rock. And you may figure out how I have this question worded wrong. Does Moses speak to a rock or strike it? So the question's wrong. He actually hit the rock, but he was supposed to speak to it. Now, before we make this confusing, Exodus chapter 17, verses 5 and 6, and the Lord said to Moses, "Go on before the people and take with you some of the elders of Israel, also taking your rod, taking your hand, your rod with which you struck the river, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock in Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water will come out of it, that the people may drink." And Moses did so on the side of the elders of Israel. So Moses is used to striking the rock. Well, later in Numbers chapter 20 and verse 7, the people are searching for water. They to the point they say, "Well, we should have just died. You know, why did you bring us out here? That would have been better for us to die." When the Lord speaks to Moses, "Take your rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together, speak to the rock before their eyes, and it will yield its water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation or animals." So Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. And he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water for you out of this rock?" Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation or animals drank. Well, without reading on, you probably know the story that this was not what God had commanded him to do, and he took him aside, and he and Aaron were both punished for not obeying. So at first Moses struck a rock, and that was okay. Later God told him to speak to it, and he struck it again, but later was punished for it. And that follows into the next one. Moses was punished for not obeying. What happened at his death? You think about all the time that Moses led the children of Israel out in the wilderness, and all of the different things that he put up with, and he spoke on their behalf, and he tried to save them. And this one instance, really, he paid the price, because he was not able to enter the land of Israel. And if you look at Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 4 through 7, I think this is kind of a fascinating ending for Noah, or for Moses. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to give Abram, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." So Moses actually went up to a mountaintop so he could see the land. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And here's what I find interesting in verse 6. "And he," as in God, "buried him in a valley in the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor, but no one knows his grave to this day." Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eyes were not dim, nor his natural vigor diminished. So God took care of him. He did punish him, but as he dies, it's almost like God specially wrapped him up and preserved him for him. That's also kind of tied in with my next point. Who were the two men in the Bible that never died? You remember there are two instances of people, and this is Genesis 5 and 24. We have Enoch. Enoch walked, I guess, in the sight of God, was pleasing to God, and it basically says, "And he was not, for God took him." And that's just about, we can read the passage, but as if he was no more, like, poof, he just disappeared. God took him. The other instance would be 2 Kings 2, 1. I guess for time's sake, I'll try to paraphrase, but Elijah and Elisha are going off. They're crossing a little stream, and Elijah knows that he's going to be taken up by God, and he says, "Elisha, stay here." And he says, "No, I'm going to go with you." And I think they do this back and forth. "No, stay here, and I'm going to go with you." And Elijah, I think, he dips his cloak in the water so they can pass across, and then as he's about to go, he says, "Ask what would you like for me to give to you?" And Elisha says, "Well, give me a double portion of your spirit," if I'm telling this correct. And so he says, "That's really a hard thing to do, but if you see me when I go, it shall be so." And so God comes down and he carries off Elijah in a whirlwind of fire. So those are really strange to me, some of these instances. God buries a person and God takes two without dying. But let's move on down into Samuel. My wife mentioned this one to me. You know, we maybe tell the story about David and think about him as being a youth in his slingshot, a young child going out against this man, this big, burly, huge giant. And Sarah said, well, there's kind of a misconception that David was actually a small man. And probably part of this comes from him putting on Saul's armor. In 1 Samuel chapter 9, in verse 2, this is where Saul is introduced interest in the Bible, and he had a choice and handsome son whose name was Saul. There was not a more handsome person than he among the children of Israel. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. So our first indication here is Saul is above average in height and size. So whether he's a foot taller or 2 foot, Saul was a very large man. And then if you move over to 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 38 through 39. So Saul clothed David with his armor, and he put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. So maybe a misconception here is they were so big they didn't fit him and he took them off. But it doesn't say that. It says, I've not tested them. Now David was he was a youth, he was a shepherd boy, he was not trained in battle, he was not used to wearing this, so really he was more comfortable having a slingshot. So there's just kind of food for thought. Maybe it wasn't so much that David was small, but Saul was bigger and he had not tested the battle. Another story about David that I find interesting, if you look at 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 19 through 23, this is after David and Bathsheba, I guess, are going to have a child. Verse 19, when David saw that his servants were whispering, David perceived that the child was dead. Therefore David said to his servants, is the child dead? And they said, he is dead. So David rose from the ground, washed and anointed himself, and changed his clothes, and he went into the house of the Lord and worshipped. Then he went to his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. And his servants said to him, what is this that you have done? You fasted and wept for the child while he was alive, but when the child died, you arose and ate food. And he said, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child may live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. It's very sad. He obviously was grieving. He wanted to have this child. And I guess the point that I make here, how do we know that babies are sinless? Apparently, David expected to go to him, that God was going to take the child. And David says, he can't come back to me, but I can go to him. And I believe there are some people who are very worried about babies and young children to the point they encourage them to be baptized even after being born, maybe for fear that they need to have sin removed. Maybe this would help in a study to say that, here was a baby that went on to God. Moving down, we're halfway through our list. The next page, did Jonah really get swallowed by a whale? Okay. This one, I might be careful in saying this one because there are so many translations today. You might catch a newer, more modern translation saying that a whale swallowed him. But in my understanding, get over to Jonah. It just says a large fish. So, here we go. Jonah, chapter 1 and 17. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. And Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from the fish's belly. And I don't personally have a problem if you believe it was a whale. We're talking about what does the Bible really say? Are we careful? I think I missed one in my list. I was going to point out, we were talking about the Garden of Eden. It doesn't say that she ate an apple. That would be another one. There's probably lots of people that think Eve goes up and picks the apple. And I fail to get that. That says she ate of the fruit. We don't know what kind of fruit. Okay. Kind of over in ancient time period, Job may be one of the oldest books in the Bible. Kids might find this interesting, and I really don't have an answer to this, but at least have a couple passages that I think are interesting. Does the Bible say anything about dinosaurs or dragons? The closest I can get would be Job chapter 40 and verse 15. Starts talking, now look at the behemoth which I made along with you. He eats grass like an ox. See now his strength is in his hips, and his power is in his stomach muscles. He moves his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are tightly knit. His bones are like beams of bronze. His ribs like bars of iron. He is the first of the ways of God. That almost makes me wonder, the first of the ways of God, one of the first things maybe God created. I don't know. Only he who made him can bring near his sword. Surely the mountains yield food for him, and all the beasts of the field play there. He lies under the lotus trees in a cover of reeds and marsh. The lotus trees cover him with their shade. The willows by the brook surround him. Indeed, the rivers may rage, yet he is not disturbed. He is confident, though the Jordan gushes into his mouth, though he takes it in his eyes, when one pierces his nose with a snare. I can't say definitively. When I read through some of these, it almost makes me think of like a big brontosaurus or something that has huge, powerful legs and a big swatting tail. But there are probably many animals that may have existed that are no more. So don't understand that. Job 41 mentions another one. Can you draw out Leviathan with a hook, or snare his tongue with a line which you lower? Can you put a reed through his nose, or pierce his jaw with a hook? Will he make many supplications to you? Will he speak softly to you? Will he make a covenant with you? Will you take him as a servant forever? Will you play with him as with a bird? Or will you leash him for your maidens? Will your companions make a banquet of him? Will they apportion him among the merchants? Can you fill his skin with harpoons, or his head with fishing spears? Lay your hand on him. Remember the battle. Never do it again. Indeed, any hope of overcoming him is false. Shall one not be overwhelmed at the sight of him? No one is so fierce that he would dare stir him up. Who then is able to stand against me? Who has preceded me that I should pay him? Everything under heaven is mine. I will not conceal his limbs, his mighty power, his graceful proportions. Who can remove his outer coat? Who can approach him with a double bridle? Who can open the doors of his face with his terrible teeth all around? His rows of scales are his pride, shut up tightly as with a seal. One is so near another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together and cannot be parted. His sneezings flash forth light, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lights. Sparks of fire shoot out. Smoke goes out of his nostrils as from a boiling pot, and burning rushes. His breath kindles coals, and a flame goes out of his mouth. Strength dwells in his neck, and sorrow dances before him. The folds of his flesh are joined together. They are firm on him and cannot be moved. I think I'll just have to stop, but just reading through that makes me think of a dragon almost. Some maybe speculate maybe it's more like an alligator with really tight scales and lots of rows of teeth. Some of these may be more fitting analogies. So, something you might Google or look into. Okay, let's move to the New Testament, and there maybe won't be as much here for us to finish. In New Testament history, at the birth of Christ, how many wise men came to visit Jesus? You know, if you talk to most people, they're going to say 3 wise men, okay? But what does the Bible actually say? It says that they came with their gifts, the gold and frankincense and myrrh, which are 3 gifts total, but does not say how many came to visit him, okay? Where were Joseph, Mary, and the baby when the wise men arrived? It's not the manger. That's kind of tricky, but you got to think back. Hobby Lobby nativity scene may be a little bit off, okay? Matthew 2 and verse 9. Says, when they heard the king, they departed, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east went before them till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they had come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. So we do have the manger scene early on where the shepherds come and visit, but the wise men apparently come later and visited the home to bring the gifts. Okay? Again, these sound like technicalities, but we'll see if we can get it right. So when did the shepherds visit? When he was born in the manger. And then another one that's maybe kind of interesting, do we ever find Mary riding on a donkey? I don't know of any passage, but that's kind of the thought as Joseph takes her to Egypt, whether it's a camel or donkey, but you know, might think when you see a children's picture that someone put that together. And another thing that we don't discuss very much is we kind of leave it with Jesus being their child, but he obviously had other children. Did you remember that he apparently had 4 brothers and sisters? This is found in Matthew chapter 13, verses 55 and 56. Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, and his sisters? Are they not all with us? Where then did this man get all these things? So they're trying to place him. We know this man. We know his family. So don't forget that there were more. One that kind of gets me is I feel like Doubting Thomas. Is that kind of a fair name for this apostle? You always hear Doubting Thomas. But the passage that always comes to mind when I think Doubting Thomas, if you read the Bible, you'll eventually hit John 11, verses 11 through 16. And the context of this would be that Lazarus has died. And Jesus is telling his apostles that he's asleep, and they don't quite understand. Well, if he's asleep, go wake him. And Jesus says plainly, Lazarus is dead. In verse 15, and I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. Then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. if Thomas understood that Lazarus was going to be raised, and he said, well, let's go die and Jesus can raise us too, or if he thought he might be in danger, I'm going to go with Jesus till the end. But apparently, Thomas might have died before Jesus. So he's not just the fearful, doubting one. The next one, how many apostles were there? So this is kind of a trick for young people. We know about the 12, and Jesus called them one by one, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, and you learn the Bible song. And then get to the end, we know that one of them betrayed, and Judas left, forsook him. Later on in Acts, they have to find a replacement, so they submit names, they cast lots, and the lot falls on Matthias, and he takes the place of Judas. And then later on, another passage I put, 1 Corinthians 15, 8, and 9, Paul calls himself an apostle born out of due season. So I come up with 14 there. If I'm missing someone, you can tell me, but there's at least 14. Another one that really, I think, bothered me for a long time was I think I had a lot of sorrow for Judas. I didn't really understand, how Jesus could choose someone, and then he knew that he would betray him, and I thought, he was the one that was going to be eternally punished. And I will be very brief and careful about what I say because there may be some debate about someone that takes their own life. But I will say that before Judas took his own life in Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 through 5, you see a totally different person than the one who betrayed him. Matthew 27, 1 through 5. When morning came on, the chief priests and elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death, and when they had bound him, they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate the governor. Then Judas, his betrayer, seeing that he had been condemned, was remorseful and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. And they said, what is that to us? You see to it. And he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple and departed and went and hanged himself. The chief priest took the silver piece and said, it's not lawful to put them in the treasury because they're the price of blood. They consulted together and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers, and the field has been called the field of blood to this day. I do feel sorry for him, but I'm also hopeful for him too, that really he kind of was repentant and he turned things around. I mentioned Lazarus being raised from the dead. The other instance I could think of someone being raised, if you look at Jesus who dies, some interesting things happen. You get kind of the darkness, the veil in the temple is torn from top to bottom, which in itself is an interesting fact. If someone went in to tear it, would you think they'd take the bottom and rip it to the top? But it's almost the fact that it was way up high and torn down. Maybe God, that there's evidence that God did that. The other thing is that apparently some of the saints who had been buried come out of their graves and they start visiting people in town. Very strange sight. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to call them zombies. I don't know exactly what state. It may be a spirit. I don't know, but if the body came back to a point that they could be recognized, I guess there would have to be some likeness of the person that they could recognize. But very strange, others who came back from the dead. And then maybe the two at the last might be topics that sometimes you hear. Someone might say, can I be saved like the thief on the cross without being baptized? And I think that it may have been Willie Franklin who came, and this is like years and years ago, came and did a little lecture or a youth night, and basically made the point, we don't know the answer to the question whether he was baptized or not. And the passages I put down there, Luke 3, verses 2 through 8, basically, John the Baptist is having a very big impact on the people or the surrounding areas. Verse 3, and he went into all the region around the Jordan, preaching a baptism of repentance for the remission of sins. It is written in the book of the words of Isaiah the prophet, the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Let's get down in verse 7. Then he said to the multitudes that came out to be baptized by him, brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come, therefore bear fruits worthy of repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father, for I say to you that Abraham is able to rise up children to Abraham from these stones. I guess he was a little harsh with those coming out, but apparently lots and lots and lots of people, it says multitudes, came out, maybe because they believed him. And it's possible that the thief, in reading the passage of his words to Jesus on the cross, he evidently believed him. If he were a believer, it's possible he could have also believed in John and been baptized. That's speculation, but it would be hard to argue and say, well, he was not. We just don't know. And then the last one that I have on the list here is the word rapture in the Bible. Of course, this is something that maybe is a word given to a passage that's found in the Bible, and the passage that comes to my mind is 1 Thessalonians 4:16 and 17. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and thus we shall always be with the Lord. This would be the only instance I can find of something like the rapture, and if you wanted to study that, but the word itself, rapture, is not in the Bible. So, there's kind of a whirlwind list. There'd be many, many other interesting things. These are some things that personally I guess I found fascinating or interesting, and maybe you found them interesting as well. Before I close, I'm going to read to you a few sayings that you also probably have heard before, and believe it or not, these are not in the Bible. The first one is cleanliness is next to godliness. And many of you have heard that one before, okay? It's possible this comes from James 4:8. Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. There's the closest we have to that one. How about money is the root of all evil? That one's probably about the closest to what it says, except it says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Some people, eager for money, have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Money's not a problem. Obviously, Abraham was very, very wealthy, and he still chose to follow God. We're examples of those wealthy people who could be pleasing. Another, spare the rod, spoil the child. This sounds like it would be right. If you look at Proverbs 13, verse 24, whoever spares the rod hates their children, and the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. So maybe these are just paraphrases, but they're not verbatim, word for word. And then this one kind of comes from this morning. All things work together for good. That's very close, but it says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Romans 8:28. How well do you know the Bible? You may know the Bible much, much better than myself. And I don't bring this lesson because I know all the answers or have all the truth. But I like to be challenged to make sure that I know that my facts are straight. So, looks like I went a little over. I appreciate your attention. I hope this was of interest to you. Just like this morning, we never want to close without offering an opportunity for those who might want to respond to the invitation. We'd love to be of any help to you if we can. If you will, please come forward as we stand and sing.